Let's hear from Kelly Johnson in that case.
Thanks. I just have a question regarding if you're saving the font somewhere else, but you still need all of the fonts, then to the user, you're just needing to download two things and it's of the same size. So I don't see where the savings is.
Okay, there's a saving if you want to update the binaries. When you update the binaries, why do you have to update the fonts at the same time?
And on my user level, I would argue that there's a lot of users that don't necessarily understand the difference, and they would rather just update one thing rather than knowing that they did or didn't and when they have to update multiple things.
Well, you insert a bit of interaction so the user gets what the user wants and the system runs the way the system wants. So the user has a button saying, update my system to 2021. And you get all the binaries updated and replaced because that's what you asked for. And your fonts, you'll get the extra fonts needed. What it is the user experience shouldn't define what the system does, and what the system does shouldn't define the user experience. You can mediate between the two. So I'm concerned that the user experience is that everything works quickly and reliably, and the user wants everything to work simply. And to mediate between the two, we've got to factor in the complexity of the thing.
That makes sense. Thank you.
That's good. Thank you.
I have a question. What percentage of tech users at any given time are typesetting without access to the internet? You know, I mean, in the best of all possible worlds, maybe I'm misthinking this, but shouldn't there not be any distribution of all these files at all, and just they should be served to every tech user and cached on their local computers, you know, when necessary and from some official place, and we don't need to send gigabytes of stuff out for any given job. So the fonts that a particular job needs would automatically get downloaded once and then cached on a user's computer, and style files and manuals, et cetera, whatever is there now would be sort of doled out on an individual basis to any given user on a specialized, you know, basically only what they need. And that would all be, you know, you could do that all automatically behind the scenes, and the user would never even know except for certain delays at the start of a new job. And then after their files are downloaded for any given job, they could typeset it offline.
You've just described the model that web pages use for JavaScript and fonts and everything else, which is the stuff gets downloaded as it's needed, it's cached invisibly to the user, and it gets discarded. Kelly has sent a comment in the chat saying, for security reasons, there are barriers to access to other sites. And that is not only for protecting the security, that's not only to protect people from visiting sites they shouldn't be visiting, but also to reduce the attack surface. Most people do have access to the internet. I have access to the internet when I'm out for a walk through my mobile phone, but the bandwidth and the price aren't very good. Another way of looking at this, I think, is what Git does. So the people that use Git often work in strange and unusual places, such as conferences and hotels and third-party workplaces and lots of things. And Git has a peer-to-peer file system, a peer-to-peer distributed file system. And in a certain sense, what you're requesting is that there should be a peer-to-peer distributed file system that tech distributions use, so that when you're typesetting a document, you don't have a resource you need, the peer-to-peer system gets it for you, assuming you have connection to the internet. And I think that's a very good solution for many people. It's not good for some use cases. So for some use cases, you want to make sure you got everything you need before you go off out into the wilderness. One of the things I have in my mind is using Git as a basis for updating distributions of tech distributions. I'll say a little bit more about that in a few minutes. Have I answered your question, Doug? Do you want a supplementary?
Oh, yes, and Kelly's comment is very important, and I haven't thought about that much. You know, there are people who have to typeset stuff in government or wherever where they don't want to be attached to the internet. But then, of course, isn't Git something you need via the internet?
Actually, no. You can do it. You can use Git with SneakerNet. I mean, some things you can't do, but the sort of things I'd like to do, you could do with SneakerNet. Let me say a little bit about that, which is that we think of Git as a version control system, which it is, but it's also what's called a content addressable store, which means that where you store something is based upon what it contains. And the way you do that is you have what's called a secure hash, which is something you can't crack, so that if two items come out with the same hash, they are the same, unless you spend £500 million on computing power. That's what security means. It doesn't mean it's impossible. It means it's enormously expensive. So if you have a Git repository, you can ask it, give me the object at this address, and it'll give you that object. In fact, the command is git cat file, I think it is, which types that file out for you. So never mind the version control system. With Git, you can create things called pack files that simply have the blobs, the data, the content in the files. So you can create a blob that has got all the font data in it, but no structure. And that might be 200 megabytes or something. And Git will allow you to extract any single file from that blob, as long as you know the key. And the version control system, or anything else you use, is a way of specifying the key indirectly by saying, here's the path, it's this folder, this subfolder, so on, so on, so on. So reorganizing everything is very cheap because nothing really moves except the pointers. And you can move pointers around very quickly. There's no effort. Whereas me moving from one place to another is more work. So with the Git system, if you set your system up to have a number of pack files and you add more pack files to that system, your system now has more objects and in particular more files. So receiving an update can simply be a matter of downloading the next volume of the encyclopedia, so to speak, and putting it in the right place. So if the increment between TeX 5.20 and 21 regarding fonts is 100 megabytes, if those are the extra fonts, you simply download that extra thing and put it in the right place, and you don't have to download all the fonts you've already downloaded. That's a technical thing about Git, and if you don't want the explanation but want to have the shortcut, Git sends the minimum it needs to send to make the effective change. So if the change is there's another font, it sends the extra font, and that's all it sends. That's all it needs to send. And it just adds it to the repository. So that's the question I had when I started this, and I started looking at the statistics, and then looking at statistics, other things came up that I wasn't expecting, such as, gosh, there's a lot of PDF documentation here. And I did look inside the folder, the zip file that contains the context documentation, and some of it is conference proceedings and stuff that's stale and stuff that nobody's ever gotten down to pruning. A bit like everybody's hard disk, it's full of all sorts of things. And we're just distributing random stuff that's not being used, or seems not to be used. And we've got a great fear of not distributing it in case it breaks something for somebody. You may not agree with my conclusions, but I hope you agree with my approach, which is to have a look at the data, and have a look at the statistics, and see how things can be done better. There's another tool I'd like to tell you about, which is a Linux-only tool, as far as I know. It's called strace, and it will tell you every time the program it produces a log of the program you're running, and it logs all the interactions with the operating system. So in particular, it logs all the opening and closings of files. And if you ask it to, it'll even log what it's reading and writing. So this allows you to run a tech job, and it runs a bit more slowly, but you get a log file from it that tells you exactly which files the system looked at, including directories, which directories and which files the system looked at. And you know, if the program didn't look at something, why does it need it? So this allows you to say, this is the minimum that's required to produce exactly the same behavior. If somebody destroys part of the hard disk, you don't notice that that part of the hard disk has been destroyed until you try to read from it. Most of the hard disk you don't use when you do a tech job. There's a sort of simple proof of that, which is that it takes time to read stuff, and the time it takes to typeset something puts a limit on how much tech could have read in that time. I think I might have gone a bit too technical. What might be helpful would be to say, well, what's people's experience of installing tech and using TechLive or MikTeX or whatever else it's using? And in particular, I'm interested in the passage of time and going from 1995 to 96, 97, before you know it's 2000, and keeping everything running the same, if that's what you want. I'm going to stop.